I should have stayed home. That thought ran through my mind for the third time as I sat alone at table 12, watching my college roommate Sarah marry into what everyone kept calling old money. The Whitman family had made their fortune in shipping generations ago, and they wanted everyone at this wedding to know it. Their reception was held at their family estate, complete with manicured gardens, a string quartet, and enough crystal to supply a small country. I'd driven 4 hours to be here, taken time off from my job as a high school guidance counselor, and bought a dress that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. But from the moment I'd arrived, it was clear that I didn't belong. "Oh, you're Sarah's friend from college," Mrs. Whitman had said when Sarah introduced us during the cocktail hour, her tone suggesting that being Sarah's college friend was roughly equivalent to being a historical curiosity. How nostalgic. The seating chart had placed me at the table furthest from the head table, surrounded by +1s and distant relatives who seemed equally confused about why they'd been relegated to what was clearly the miscellaneous guest section. During dinner, I'd tried to make conversation with the woman next to me, only to discover that she was the caterer's assistant who'd been seated there by mistake. Sarah had been my roommate for 3 years, my maid of honor when I'd married David, and the person I'd called when David died 2 years ago. We'd stayed close through different life paths, her pursuing art history and eventually meeting Preston Whitman III at a gallery opening, me becoming a teacher and losing my husband to cancer before we'd had time to start the family we'd planned. But tonight, surrounded by people who spoke casually about their summer houses and charity galas, I felt like I was watching Sarah's life through glass. She looked radiant in her custom wedding gown, laughing at something Preston's Harvard roommate was saying, completely absorbed in her new world of privilege and possibility. When it came time for toasts, I'd planned to slip out early. I had a long drive home and an early morning meeting with a student who was struggling with college applications. But as I gathered my purse, Preston stood at the microphone with the easy confidence that came from a lifetime of commanding attention. "Before we end this perfect evening," he said, his voice carrying across the reception tent, "I want to thank everyone who made this celebration possible. My parents, for sharing their beautiful home. Sarah's parents, for raising such an incredible woman. Our wedding party, for standing with us today." The usual acknowledgments continued. The caterer, the band, the photographer. I was halfway to the exit when Preston's voice stopped me. "And I want to give special thanks to someone whose generosity has left Sarah and me speechless. When we mentioned that we were hoping to find a small place in the mountains for weekend getaways, we never expected anyone to take that dream and make it reality." I turned back, curious about which wealthy relative had surprised them with a vacation property. "Margaret Chen, would you please stand up?" Every eye in the tent turned toward table 12, where I stood frozen, certain I'd misheard my name. Margaret, Sarah's college roommate, has given us the most incredible honeymoon gift, a fully furnished house in Asheville, North Carolina, complete with hiking trails and mountain views. Sarah and I are overwhelmed by your kindness and can't wait to create memories in our new retreat. The applause was polite but confused. I could see people glancing around, trying to figure out who I was and how a high school guidance counselor could afford to give away houses. Sarah's face showed genuine shock. She'd had no idea about the gift, which had been arranged through my attorney to arrive as a surprise during their honeymoon. Mrs. Whitman's expression suggested she was recalculating everything she thought she knew about her daughter-in-law's college friendships. I managed a smile and a small wave before making my escape to the parking lot, where the valet looked confused when I handed him the ticket for my 10-year-old Honda Civic. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of voices speculating about the mysterious gift and the woman who'd given it. Driving home through the mountain roads, I thought about the house I'd bought for Sarah and Preston, a beautiful craftsman cottage with 3 bedrooms, 2 acres of privacy, and views that had reminded me of the places David and I had dreamed of visiting together. The purchase had been impulsive, inspired by Sarah's casual mention during our last phone call that she and Preston were looking for a mountain retreat but couldn't find anything in their budget. What Sarah didn't know, what none of our college friends knew, was that David had been far more than a high school teacher. He'd also been a software developer who'd created a data analysis program that 3 major corporations had licensed for millions of dollars. When he died, he'd left me wealthy enough to never work again, but I'd kept teaching because I loved helping students navigate their futures. I'd also kept our financial situation private, partly because David had been modest about his success, and partly because I'd learned that money changed relationships in ways that weren't always comfortable. It was easier to let people see me as Margaret, the guidance counselor, rather than Margaret, the millionaire widow. But watching Sarah at her wedding, seeing how effortlessly she'd integrated into a world where generosity was measured in yacht donations and art collection gifts, I'd realized that I wanted to give her something that would remind her of the friendship that had sustained us through college stress, career uncertainties, and life changes. The house had been my way of saying that just because our lives had taken different directions didn't mean I'd forgotten the woman who'd held my hand through my first heartbreak, celebrated my teaching job like it was a Nobel Prize, and called me every week after David's funeral to make sure I was eating regularly. 3 days later, I was reviewing college applications in my office when my assistant announced that I had a visitor. Sarah stood in the doorway, looking exactly like she had in college when she was wrestling with a difficult decision. "Margaret, we need to talk." I gestured for her to sit in the chair across from my desk, the same chair where I'd counseled hundreds of students about their futures. "Sarah, how was the honeymoon?" "The honeymoon was beautiful, and the house is incredible. But Margaret, why didn't you tell me you could afford to buy houses for people? And more importantly, why are you still working as a guidance counselor, if you have that kind of money?" I'd prepared for this conversation, but facing Sarah made it more difficult than I'd anticipated. "Because I love this work, and because money doesn't change who you are unless you let it." Sarah studied my face with the same intensity she brought to analyzing paintings. "Margaret, how long have you been wealthy?" "Since David died. He developed software that was more successful than either of us realized. He set up the licensing agreements to provide for our future, but he died before we could enjoy it together." "And you never told me?" "Sarah, what would have changed if you'd known? Would it have made our friendship more genuine, or would it have made you wonder whether I was buying your affection?" Sarah was quiet for several minutes, processing information that recontextualized years of our relationship. "Margaret, I've been feeling guilty since the wedding. Preston's family was dismissive of you, and I didn't defend you the way I should have. I was so caught up in trying to fit into their world that I forgot to appreciate the people who've always been part of mine. Sarah, you don't need to apologize for your in-laws' behavior. And you don't need to feel guilty about building a life with Preston. But I do need to understand why my best friend has been living like she's struggling financially when she could afford anything she wanted." I thought about how to explain choices that had seemed obvious to me but might sound incomprehensible to someone who just married into wealth. "Sarah, after David died, I had enough money to travel the world, buy whatever I wanted, live anywhere I chose. But the work I do here, helping kids figure out their futures, feels like the most meaningful way I can spend my time. The money is just insurance that I'll never have to worry about security while I do work that matters. And the house? Why such an expensive gift? Because you mentioned wanting a mountain retreat, and I wanted to give you something that would make you happy. The specific dollar amount was irrelevant. It was about creating a place where you and Preston could build memories together." Sarah looked around my small office, taking in the college pennants, student artwork, and motivational posters that decorated the walls. "Margaret, Preston's family spent the last 3 days of our honeymoon speculating about who you really are. Mrs. Whitman is convinced you're either a secret heiress or involved in something illegal." I laughed, imagining the conversations that had taken place in the Whitman family circles. "What did you tell them?" "I told them you're exactly who you've always been. Someone who cares more about helping people than impressing them. But Margaret, I also told them they'd underestimated you, and that underestimating you was their loss, not yours." "How did that go over?" "About as well as you'd expect. But Preston was impressed by the way you handled the attention at the wedding. He said most people would have used that moment to make a speech or demand recognition, but you just quietly left. Because the gift wasn't about getting recognition. It was about you and Preston having a place where you could be happy together." Sarah stood up and walked to the window overlooking the school's courtyard, where students were eating lunch and talking about whatever crisis currently dominated their 17-year-old lives. "Margaret, can I ask you something that might sound selfish?" "Of course. Are you happy? Really happy? Not just content or satisfied, but genuinely happy with the life you've chosen?" The question caught me off guard, forcing me to examine feelings I'd been avoiding since David's death. "Most days, yes. The work feels meaningful, the students keep me engaged, and I have enough resources that I never have to worry about practical concerns. But sometimes I wonder if I'm hiding behind the work instead of building a new life that honors David's memory while still allowing for future happiness. Sarah turned back to face me. Margaret, what would David want for you? He'd want me to be happy. He'd want me to use the resources he provided to create a life full of purpose and connection. He probably wouldn't understand why I'm still working in the same job when I could afford to do anything, but he'd support whatever choice made me feel fulfilled. And do you feel fulfilled? I thought about the question while watching students navigate the social complexities of high school, the same complexities that would follow them into college and careers and marriages. I feel useful. I'm not sure that's the same as fulfilled. Sarah returned to her chair, leaning forward with the intensity that had made her such a good art history student. Margaret, I have a proposal for you. What kind of proposal? Preston and I want to establish a foundation focused on educational opportunities for students who show academic promise but lack financial resources. We'd like you to run it. The offer was unexpected but intriguing. Sarah, why are you proposing this now? Because watching you at the wedding made me realize that you've been underestimating yourself as much as everyone else has been underestimating you. You have the educational expertise, the financial resources, and the passion for helping students succeed. Instead of counseling 30 kids a year, you could help thousands. I felt the stirring of possibility, the same feeling I'd had when David first explained his software ideas and I'd realized he was describing something that could change both our lives. What would this foundation look like? Scholarships, obviously, but also mentorship programs, college preparation resources, and support systems that help first-generation college students navigate higher education successfully. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed me preliminary notes she'd apparently been working on since the honeymoon. We're thinking of starting with a pilot program in 3 school districts, then expanding based on what we learn about effective intervention strategies. And my role would be? Executive Director. You'd design the programs, hire the staff, and oversee the implementation. You'd essentially be doing what you do now, but at a scale that could impact thousands of students instead of dozens. The conversation continued for 2 hours, with Sarah outlining a vision for educational philanthropy that would combine her family's new resources with my expertise and passion for student development. Sarah, I need time to think about this. It would mean leaving a job I love for something completely new. I understand. But Margaret, I also think it would mean stepping into a role that could honor David's memory while creating opportunities for students who remind you of yourself. That evening, I sat in the living room David and I had shared, surrounded by furniture we'd chosen together and books we'd planned to read in retirement. The house felt both comfortable and limiting, a shrine to a life that had ended before we'd fully lived it. I thought about the foundation Sarah had proposed, about the students I could help, about the possibility of building something meaningful with the resources David had provided. I also thought about the way I'd felt at Sarah's wedding. Invisible, underestimated, relegated to the margins of a celebration that should have been about friendship as much as romance. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in a conference room with Sarah, Preston, and 2 attorneys, reviewing the legal documents that would establish the Blackwood Foundation for Educational Excellence. The name honored David's memory while creating an identity separate from the Whitman family's existing charitable activities. Margaret, Preston said, looking remarkably different from the privileged young man I'd observed at his wedding. I owe you an apology for my family's behavior at our reception. They made assumptions about you that were both wrong and rude. Preston, people make assumptions based on incomplete information. It's human nature. Maybe. But it's not acceptable behavior. Sarah helped me understand that you've been choosing to live modestly while possessing the resources to live extravagantly, and that choice reflects character that my family failed to recognize. The Foundation's first board meeting was held 6 months later, in an office space we'd rented in the downtown area where I'd once been afraid to park my Honda Civic. The conference room was filled with educators, community leaders, and students who'd helped design our pilot programs. The first round of scholarships will support 47 students across 3 school districts, I reported to the board. But more importantly, we've established mentorship programs that connect each scholarship recipient with professionals in their chosen fields. Sarah, now serving as the Foundation's Director of Community Partnerships, added details about the support systems we developed for first-generation college students. We're not just providing money, she explained. We're providing the cultural knowledge and social connections that help students succeed in higher education environments that might otherwise feel intimidating or unwelcoming. The program's success exceeded our most optimistic projections. Students who'd been told they weren't, quote, college material were earning academic honors. Young people who'd never imagined higher education as accessible were choosing career paths that aligned with their talents and interests. But the most satisfying moment came during our first annual scholarship ceremony, when Maria Santos, a high school senior whose family had immigrated from Guatemala, stood at the podium to address the gathered donors and recipients. 2 years ago, she said, my guidance counselor told me I should focus on vocational training instead of college because students like me weren't prepared for academic rigor. Today I'm announcing my acceptance to MIT's engineering program with full scholarship support from the Blackwood Foundation. Maria's story was repeated dozens of times that evening as students shared their journeys from limited expectations to unlimited possibilities. After the ceremony, Sarah and I stood in the reception area, watching scholarship recipients talk with board members about their academic plans and career aspirations. Margaret, Sarah said, do you ever regret leaving guidance counseling? I looked around the room at young people who'd been given opportunities to discover their own potential, at mentors who'd volunteered their time to support the next generation, at a community that had formed around the simple idea that talent existed everywhere, but opportunity did not. I miss the daily interaction with students, I replied, but I don't regret building something that can help thousands of young people instead of dozens. And the money? Any regrets about revealing your financial situation? I thought about the journey from that awkward wedding reception, where I'd been dismissed as an irrelevant college friend, to this celebration of educational achievement and community support. The money was always just a tool, Sarah. David earned it, I inherited it, but what matters is using it to create opportunities for others to build meaningful lives. Even if it means people treat you differently now that they know you're wealthy? People have always treated me according to their assumptions about my worth. Now they just make different assumptions. 5 years after the wedding, where I'd been ignored, the Blackwood Foundation had grown into a nationally recognized organization supporting educational equity and student success. We'd helped over 3,000 students access higher education, established mentorship networks in 12 states, and developed programs that were being replicated by other foundations. But the most meaningful change wasn't institutional, it was personal. I'd learned that true generosity wasn't about the size of gifts but about the intention behind them. The house I'd given Sarah and Preston had been meaningful not because of its cost, but because it represented friendship that transcended different life circumstances. More importantly, I'd discovered that David's legacy wasn't just the money he'd left me, but the opportunity to use that money in ways that honored both his memory and my own values. Sarah and Preston's marriage had thrived, strengthened by shared commitment to work that served others rather than just serving themselves. They'd found purpose in using their combined resources, Preston's family wealth and my foundation expertise, to create opportunities for young people who reminded them of their younger selves. And I'd learned that being underestimated wasn't necessarily a disadvantage. Sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was exceed expectations so completely that people had to reconsider everything they thought they knew about worth, generosity, and the different ways success could be measured. The groom had thanked me for the honeymoon gift of a house, but the real gift had been the reminder that true wealth lay not in what you could afford to buy, but in what you chose to build with the resources you'd been given. They'd ignored me at the wedding because they couldn't see past their assumptions about guidance counselors and college friends, and people who drove modest cars to elegant receptions. But in the end, being overlooked had been its own kind of gift. The freedom to act according to my values rather than others' expectations, to give without seeking recognition, and to build something meaningful with the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing the impact mattered more than the acknowledgement. The house had been just the beginning. 7 years after that wedding reception, I was reviewing applications for the Foundation's newest initiative when my assistant knocked on my office door with an expression I'd learned to recognize as complicated news. Margaret, there's a delegation from the Whitman Family Trust here to see you. They don't have an appointment, but they say it's urgent. The Whitman Family Trust. I'd heard Preston mention it occasionally, usually in the context of family obligations and charitable expectations that came with inheriting old money. Sarah had once described it as a way for Preston's grandparents to control family philanthropy from beyond the grave. Send them in. 3 people entered my office. Mrs. Elizabeth Whitman, Preston's mother, whom I remembered from the wedding, a distinguished man in his 60s who introduced himself as Charles Whitman, Preston's uncle and chairman of the family trust, and a woman about my age who carried herself with the controlled intensity of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. "Miss Chen," Mrs. Whitman began, her tone considerably warmer than it had been at the wedding. "Thank you for seeing us without advance notice. I believe you know my brother-in-law Charles, and this is Victoria Ashford, the Trust's executive director." I gestured for them to sit around the conference table, noting that Mrs. Whitman seemed nervous while Charles appeared to be evaluating my office with the careful attention of someone conducting due diligence. "What can I do for you?" Victoria Ashford opened a leather portfolio and withdrew documents that looked official and substantial. "Ms. Chen, we're here to discuss a proposition that could significantly expand the scope of your educational work. What kind of proposition?" Charles leaned forward, his demeanor suggesting this was a conversation he'd been preparing for extensively. "Ms. Chen, the Whitman Family Trust has been observing the success of your Blackwood Foundation for several years. Your outcomes data is remarkable. College completion rates, career placement statistics, long-term success metrics that exceed national averages by substantial margins. Thank you. We've worked hard to develop programming that addresses systemic barriers to educational achievement." "Indeed," Victoria continued, "which is why the Trust is prepared to offer a partnership that would provide substantial additional resources for educational equity initiatives." She slid a document across the table that made me blink twice to ensure I was reading the numbers correctly. "The Whitman Family Trust is prepared to contribute $50 million over 5 years to expand the Blackwood Foundation's operations nationally, with the goal of serving 50,000 students annually by the end of the partnership period." I studied the proposal while processing the implications of what they were offering. $50 million would transform the foundation from a regional success story into a national force for educational change. "This is generous beyond anything I would have expected," I said carefully. "What would the Trust expect in return?" Mrs. Whitman exchanged glances with Charles before answering. "Miss Chen, I need to be frank with you about something. When you first attended Sarah and Preston's wedding, our family underestimated you significantly. I remember. We made assumptions based on superficial observations, and those assumptions led us to treat you with less respect than you deserved. Subsequently, watching your work with the foundation and observing the impact you've achieved, we've come to understand that we missed an opportunity to recognize exceptional capability." Charles nodded in agreement. "Ms. Chen, the Whitman family has a long history of supporting educational causes, but our approach has been traditional, funding established institutions, supporting capital campaigns, providing scholarships through existing university systems, whereas your model," Victoria added, "addresses educational inequity at its source. You're not just helping students who've already succeeded navigate elite institutions. You're identifying potential in communities where it's often overlooked and providing comprehensive support that makes higher education accessible." I was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about expanding the foundation's reach. It was about the Whitman family acknowledging that their traditional approach to philanthropy had been missing something essential. "The Trust is interested in learning from your methodology," Mrs. Whitman continued. "But more than that, we're interested in supporting work that achieves measurable impact rather than just maintaining institutional prestige." What would partnership with the Trust mean in practical terms? Victoria outlined a framework that was both ambitious and carefully structured. The Whitman Trust would provide funding and leverage their network of contacts to help establish Blackwood Foundation programs in major metropolitan areas across the country. In return, the foundation would document and share its methodologies so other organizations could replicate successful interventions. "We're not interested in controlling your operations," Charles emphasized. "We're interested in scaling your impact while preserving the principles that make your approach effective." The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering everything from governance structures to outcome measurements to the cultural challenges of operating educational programs in communities with different socioeconomic contexts. "Ms. Chen," Mrs. Whitman said as the meeting concluded, "I hope you'll consider this partnership seriously. But I also want to apologize personally for the way our family treated you at Preston and Sarah's wedding. We failed to recognize your worth, and that failure reflected our own limitations rather than yours." After they left, I sat alone in my office, staring at the partnership proposal, and thinking about the journey from that awkward wedding reception to this moment of recognition and opportunity. My phone rang 20 minutes later. Sarah's voice carried excitement that was audible even through the speaker. "Margaret, Preston's mother just called me. She said the family trust made a partnership offer to the foundation. Please tell me you're considering it." "I'm considering it, but I'm also cautious about partnerships that could change the foundation's mission or methodology. Margaret, what if I told you that this partnership was Preston's idea, and that he's been arguing with his family for 2 years about the need to support educational work that actually creates opportunities, rather than just maintaining existing advantages?" That was news I hadn't expected. Preston proposed this? He's been researching educational philanthropy models, and he kept coming back to your foundation as an example of work that achieved sustainable impact. When he presented your success data to the Trust's board, they realized they'd been funding programs that felt good but didn't change much. Sarah's explanation recontextualized the entire proposal. This wasn't a wealthy family offering charity to a worthy cause. It was recognition that the foundation's approach represented something they wanted to learn from and support. "Sarah, assuming I agree to this partnership, what happens to the foundation's independence?" "That's the beautiful part, Margaret. The Trust wants to fund your work specifically because you've proven that independent, community-based programming achieves better outcomes than top-down institutional approaches. And Preston's family is comfortable with that arrangement?" Preston's family has spent the past 2 years learning that their traditional approach to philanthropy was more about maintaining their social status than creating meaningful change. Watching your foundation's success has been educational for all of them. 3 weeks later, I was standing in front of the Blackwood Foundation's expanded board of directors, presenting the partnership proposal to people who'd helped build our programs from grassroots initiatives into nationally recognized models for educational equity. The Whitman Trust partnership would allow us to serve 50,000 students annually within 5 years, I explained, showing projections that illustrated the potential scope of impact. But it would also require us to systematize our approaches in ways that preserve effectiveness while enabling replication. Dr. James Martinez, our Director of Academic Programs and a former first-generation college student himself, raised the concern that had been weighing on my mind since the initial meeting. "Margaret, how do we ensure that scaling up doesn't dilute the personal relationships and community connections that make our programming effective?" It was exactly the right question. Our success had been built on understanding local contexts, developing trust with students and families, and adapting our support systems to meet specific community needs. Dr. Martinez, that's why the partnership includes provisions for extensive staff training and community partnership development. We're not franchising our programs. We're developing local capacity to implement our principles while adapting to regional contexts. Maria Santos, now a board member after graduating from MIT and returning to work in educational technology, offered the perspective of someone who'd experienced our programming as a student. "What concerns me," she said, "is whether national expansion might attract political attention that could interfere with our ability to serve undocumented students and other vulnerable populations." It was another crucial consideration. Some of our most successful interventions had involved helping students whose immigration status made traditional educational pathways complicated or risky. "Maria, the partnership agreement includes specific protections for student privacy and community autonomy. The Whitman Trust has committed to defending our programming against political interference, even if that means accepting controversy." The board discussion continued for 3 hours, with members raising thoughtful questions about governance, sustainability, cultural sensitivity, and the challenges of maintaining mission focus while managing rapid growth. The final vote was unanimous in favor of accepting the partnership, but with modifications that preserved the foundation's independence and community-based approach. 6 months into the Whitman Trust partnership, I was traveling constantly, visiting communities where new Blackwood Foundation programs were being established, and working with local educators to adapt our model to different regional contexts. The work was exhilarating, but exhausting. In Detroit, I met with teachers who were helping students navigate post-industrial economic realities while maintaining hope for educational advancement. In rural Alabama, I worked with community leaders who were addressing the challenges of geographic isolation and limited resources. In Los Angeles, I collaborated with advocates serving immigrant communities, where educational opportunity intersected with complex legal and social barriers. Each location required different strategies, but the underlying principles remained constant. Identify student potential early, provide comprehensive support systems, and create pathways to educational achievement that honored students' backgrounds while expanding their possibilities. "Margaret," Sarah said during one of our monthly check-ins, "you look exhausted. When was the last time you took time off?" I was calling from a hotel room in Phoenix, where I'd spent the day training staff for our newest program site. "Sarah, I love this work, but you're right about the exhaustion. I feel like I'm trying to be personally involved in every program implementation." Which is exactly what we predicted would happen when you started scaling up. You're trying to maintain the same level of personal oversight that worked when we had 3 program sites, but now you have 37. Sarah was right, as usual. The foundation's rapid growth had outpaced my ability to maintain direct involvement in every aspect of programming, but I was struggling to delegate responsibilities that felt too important to entrust to others. "Sarah, how do I ensure quality and maintain our principles without being personally involved in every decision?" "By hiring people who share your values and training them well enough that they can make good decisions independently." "Margaret, you've created systems and methodologies that work. Now you need to trust other people to implement them." The conversation forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding. The success of the Blackwood Foundation had grown beyond what any individual person could manage directly, and continuing to try would eventually undermine everything we'd built. Over the following months, I focused on developing leadership teams at each program site, establishing clear protocols for decision-making, and creating accountability systems that maintained quality without requiring my constant oversight. The transition was difficult, requiring me to trust that other people could uphold standards I'd spent years developing, but it was also liberating, allowing me to focus on strategic development and program innovation rather than daily operational management. The Foundation's 3rd annual conference brought together over 200 staff members, community partners, and students from across the country. Walking through the hotel conference center, listening to conversations about successful interventions and innovative approaches to educational equity, I felt pride in what we'd accomplished, but also amazement at how far the work had evolved beyond my original vision. "Margaret," a voice called out behind me. I turned to see Dr. Angela Williams, who'd been one of our first scholarship recipients and was now completing her doctorate in education policy at Stanford. "Angela, how's the dissertation coming?" "It's focused on community-based educational programming, actually. I'm studying the Blackwood Foundation model and comparing it to traditional institutional approaches to educational equity." Angela's research represented something I'd never anticipated when we started the foundation. Our work was becoming the subject of academic study, with former students contributing to scholarly understanding of effective educational intervention. "What are your preliminary findings?" "That relationship-based programming achieves significantly better long-term outcomes than resource-based programming. Students who receive comprehensive support and mentorship are more likely to succeed academically and more likely to give back to their communities after graduation." Angela's research confirmed what we'd observed anecdotally but hadn't documented systematically. The Foundation's emphasis on personal relationships and community connection was producing graduates who became community leaders and educational advocates themselves. "Angela, would you be interested in joining our research and evaluation team after you complete your doctorate? We need people who understand both our methodology and academic standards for documenting impact." "Margaret, I'd be honored. This foundation changed my life, and I want to help ensure it can change other students' lives for decades to come." The conference's keynote address was delivered by Roberto Hernandez, a young man who'd entered our program as a high school sophomore, struggling with family poverty and academic underperformance. Now 24, he was a software engineer who'd started his own company focused on educational technology for underserved communities. 5 years ago, Roberto told the assembled crowd, My guidance counselor suggested I consider vocational training because my family background and academic record didn't suggest college potential. Last month, my company received venture capital funding to develop tutoring software that's now being used in 300 schools across 12 states. Roberto's story was repeated throughout the conference as students, staff members, and community partners shared testimonials about the foundation's impact. But what struck me most wasn't the individual success stories, it was the systemic change our work was creating. Communities where Blackwood Foundation programs operated were experiencing measurable improvements in college enrollment rates, economic mobility, and civic engagement. Students who'd benefited from our programming were returning to their communities as teachers, social workers, entrepreneurs, and advocates, creating multiplier effects that extended far beyond our direct intervention. "Margaret," Preston said, approaching me during the conference's final reception, "I wanted to share something with you that might surprise you." Preston had become much more involved in the Foundation's work over the past year, serving on our Policy Advocacy Committee and helping navigate the political challenges that came with rapid expansion. "What's that?" "My grandmother's trust includes provisions for educational philanthropy that we've never fully implemented because we couldn't find programming that met her standards for impact and integrity." Preston's grandmother had been a teacher before marrying into the Whitman family, and she'd apparently insisted that any educational philanthropy funded by her trust should directly benefit students rather than just supporting institutional prestige. "The Trust's board met last week to review our partnership with your foundation, and they voted unanimously to release an additional $25 million for program expansion, specifically because your work embodies the principles my grandmother wanted to support. The additional funding would allow us to establish programs in rural communities that had been underserved by traditional educational philanthropy, extending our reach to areas where geographic isolation and limited resources created unique barriers to educational achievement." Preston, please thank the board for their confidence in our work, but also tell them that we'll use this funding to honor your grandmother's vision of education as a pathway to opportunity, rather than a privilege reserved for the already advantaged. As the conference concluded and participants returned to their home communities, I found myself reflecting on the journey from that wedding reception, where I'd been dismissed as an irrelevant college friend, to this moment of leading a national organization that was changing educational outcomes for thousands of students. The transformation hadn't been just about resources or recognition. It had been about discovering that true wealth lay in the ability to create opportunities for others to discover their own potential. David's software development success had provided the financial foundation, but the real value had come from using those resources to build something that honored both his memory and my own commitment to educational equity. 2 years later, the Blackwood Foundation was operating in 47 states, serving over 30,000 students annually, and had become a model for community-based educational programming that was being studied and replicated by organizations around the world. But the personal moment that mattered most came during a quiet evening at Sarah and Preston's mountain house, the same house I'd given them as a wedding gift 8 years earlier. "Margaret," Sarah said as we sat on the deck overlooking mountain views that had inspired countless weekend retreats and family gatherings, "do you ever think about that wedding where everyone ignored you?" I looked out over the landscape that had become a symbol of enduring friendship despite different life circumstances. I think about how invisible I felt, and how that invisibility turned out to be a gift. How so? Because being underestimated gave me the freedom to act according to my values rather than others' expectations. If people had known about my financial resources from the beginning, every gesture would have been interpreted differently. Preston joined us on the deck, carrying coffee and wearing the comfortable clothes that suggested he'd finally learned to relax during their mountain retreats. "Margaret, Sarah and I have been talking about something we'd like to propose to you." "What kind of proposal?" Sarah leaned forward with the excitement that had characterized her best ideas since college. "We want to establish an endowment that will ensure the Blackwood Foundation can continue operating in perpetuity, regardless of changes in external funding or political climates." Preston nodded in agreement. "The Whitman Family Trust has voted to contribute $100 million to this endowment, but we want you to consider contributing as well, so the foundation will always reflect your vision and values." The proposal was both generous and thoughtful, a way to ensure that the educational work we'd built together would continue long after any of us were involved in its leadership. How much would you want me to contribute? Whatever feels right to you, Sarah replied. This isn't about matching funds or demonstrating financial commitment. It's about creating permanent security for work that's too important to depend on year-to-year fundraising. I thought about David's legacy, about the software success that had provided resources far beyond what either of us had ever needed, and about the opportunity to ensure that those resources would continue creating educational opportunities for generations of students. I'll contribute $50 million to the endowment, I decided. David would have wanted his success to support students who remind me of our younger selves, people with potential that others might overlook or underestimate. The endowment was established 6 months later, with a ceremony attended by foundation staff, board members, students, and community partners from across the country. But the moment that moved me most was when Maria Santos, now the foundation's Director of Student Services, stood at the podium to address the gathered crowd. 10 years ago, she said, a guidance counselor told me I wasn't college material. Today, I'm announcing that the Blackwood Foundation has helped over 50,000 students access higher education, and that our alumni are now teachers, doctors, engineers, social workers, entrepreneurs, and advocates who are changing their communities. Maria paused, looking directly at me. But more importantly, this foundation has proven that potential exists everywhere, and that the only thing standing between students and success is often the opportunity to demonstrate what they're capable of achieving. After the ceremony, I found myself alone in the garden outside the hotel where we'd held the endowment celebration. It was a beautiful evening, with stars visible despite the city lights, and I felt a sense of completion that had been missing since David's death. My phone buzzed with a text message from a number I didn't recognize. Ms. Chen, this is Tommy Rodriguez. You probably don't remember me, but you helped me get into college 8 years ago, when I was struggling in high school. I wanted you to know that I just finished my residency and will be starting work as a pediatrician in my hometown next month. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. I did remember Tommy, a shy, brilliant young man whose family had been skeptical about college expenses but who'd shown exceptional aptitude for science. He was one of hundreds of students whose lives had been changed by foundation programming, but his message reminded me why the work mattered beyond statistics and success metrics. Each student we'd helped represented not just individual achievement, but community transformation and generational change that would ripple through families and neighborhoods for decades to come. Walking back into the hotel, I passed a group of current foundation students discussing their college plans and career aspirations with the confidence that came from knowing their potential was recognized and supported. These young people would never experience the feeling of being ignored or dismissed because of others' assumptions about their worth. They would grow up understanding that education was a right rather than a privilege, that support was available when they needed it, and that their success mattered to people who'd invested in their potential. The journey from that wedding reception, where I'd been relegated to table 12, had led to something I'd never anticipated: a life that honored David's memory while creating opportunities for thousands of young people to discover their own capabilities. I'd been ignored at the wedding because people couldn't see past their assumptions about guidance counselors and modest lifestyles and college friends who didn't fit their social expectations. But that dismissal had taught me that true wealth wasn't about recognition or status. It was about the ability to create meaningful change without needing acknowledgement, to give generously without expecting gratitude, and to build something beautiful from the quiet satisfaction of knowing the impact mattered more than the visibility. The house had been just the beginning. The foundation had become the legacy. And the students who were now changing their communities represented the perpetual gift that would continue long after anyone remembered the woman who'd once been invisible at a wedding reception. They'd ignored me at the wedding, but the work we'd built together would never be ignored. It would continue creating opportunities, challenging assumptions, and proving that potential existed everywhere, if you had the wisdom to recognize it and the courage to support it. That was a legacy worthy of David's memory, Sarah's friendship, and every student who'd ever been told they weren't capable of achieving their dreams. The groom had thanked me for a house, but what we'd built together was something far more valuable. Proof that being underestimated was often just the beginning of the most meaningful success stories. 15 years after the wedding, where I'd sat alone at table 12, I stood before the United States Senate Subcommittee on Education, testifying about the Blackwood Foundation's research on educational equity and community-based programming. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who'd once been dismissed as an irrelevant college friend was now advising federal policymakers on educational reform. Senator Morrison, I said, responding to a question about scalability, our data shows that community-based educational programming achieves superior outcomes precisely because it adapts to local contexts, rather than imposing standardized solutions. Senator Morrison, a former teacher herself, leaned forward with interest. Ms. Chen, your foundation now operates in all 50 states. How do you maintain quality and consistency while allowing for local adaptation? Senator, we've learned that consistency should be measured by outcomes rather than methods. Our programs look different in rural Montana than they do in urban Philadelphia, but they achieve similar results because they're built on the same underlying principles: early identification of potential, comprehensive support systems, and community partnership. The hearing was part of a broader congressional initiative to reform federal education policy, and the Blackwood Foundation had been invited to testify because our longitudinal research had documented what many policymakers suspected but couldn't prove: that effective educational intervention required understanding local communities rather than imposing external solutions. After my testimony, I was approached by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who'd served as our Director of Community Programs before being recruited to lead the Department of Education's Office of Innovation and Improvement. Margaret, I wanted to thank you for agreeing to testify today. Your research is influencing policy discussions at the highest levels of government. Jennifer, that's gratifying, but I hope it's also leading to actual changes in how we support student achievement. It is. The Secretary is developing new guidelines for federal education funding that prioritize community partnership and long-term outcome measurement over standardized test performance. The policy implications were significant. If federal education funding shifted toward supporting community-based programming, thousands of organizations could replicate and adapt the Blackwood Foundation's approach to serve students in their own regional contexts. But as I flew home from Washington, I found myself thinking less about policy influence and more about personal legacy. At 55, I'd built something that would outlast my direct involvement, but I'd also spent 15 years focused entirely on professional achievement without developing meaningful personal relationships. David had been gone for 13 years, and while I'd honored his memory through foundation work, I'd never seriously considered whether he would have wanted me to remain single indefinitely. Our conversations about the future had always included plans for travel, new experiences, and shared adventures that cancer had prevented us from pursuing. My reflection was interrupted by a phone call from Sarah, whose voice carried the excitement that usually meant she'd discovered something important. Margaret, I need to tell you about a conversation I had yesterday that I think will interest you. What kind of conversation? With Dr. Michael Torres, the education researcher from Stanford who's been studying foundation alumni outcomes. He asked me to arrange an introduction to you, not for professional reasons, but because he wanted to meet the person behind the work he's been researching. Sarah's tone suggested this wasn't entirely about academic collaboration. Sarah, are you attempting to set me up with someone? I'm suggesting that you meet someone who understands and appreciates the work you've dedicated your life to, and who might be interesting company for the personal life you've been neglecting. Dr. Michael Torres turned out to be a widower himself, a former high school principal who'd earned his doctorate after his wife's death, and was now researching the intersection of community engagement and educational achievement. We met for coffee at a cafe near Stanford's campus, ostensibly to discuss his research on foundation alumni, but actually to determine whether two people who'd rebuilt their lives after loss might find companionship in shared work and values. Margaret, he said, reviewing survey data from foundation graduates, what strikes me most about your programming isn't the immediate outcomes, college enrollment, scholarship awards, academic achievement. It's the long-term community impact. Your alumni are disproportionately likely to return to their home communities as educators, social workers, and civic leaders. That's intentional, I replied. We don't just want students to succeed individually, we want them to become advocates for educational opportunity in their own communities. Which explains why regions with Blackwood Foundation programming show sustained improvements in educational outcomes, even for students who aren't directly served by your organization. Michael's research had documented something we'd hoped for but hadn't been able to measure systematically. Foundation programming was creating cultural shifts that benefited entire communities, not just individual scholarship recipients. Michael, what does your research suggest about the conditions necessary for this kind of systemic impact? Long-term commitment, local ownership, and leadership that comes from the community itself rather than being imposed from outside. We talked for 3 hours, our conversation moving from research methodology to personal philosophy to the challenges of building meaningful work after loss. By the time we parted, I understood why Sarah had thought we might find each other interesting. Michael was intelligent without being academic, passionate about educational equity without being idealistic, and comfortable with the kind of life that prioritized purpose over convenience. He was also someone who understood that professional success could coexist with personal loss, and that building something meaningful after tragedy was both healing and honoring. Our relationship developed slowly, built around shared interests in educational research, weekend hiking trips in the mountains near Stanford, and long conversations about the intersection of personal values and professional achievement. "Margaret," he said during one of our walks through the redwood forests near Santa Cruz, "can I ask you something that might sound presumptuous?" "Of course. Do you think David would approve of the life you've built? Not just the foundation work, but the personal choices you've made since his death?" The question was one I'd avoided asking myself directly, though it had lingered in the background of every major decision for 13 years. "I think David would be proud of the foundation and the impact we've achieved," I said carefully. "But I also think he'd want me to build a life that included personal happiness alongside professional fulfillment." "And have you done that?" "I'm learning to. Meeting you has reminded me that there's a difference between honoring someone's memory and limiting your own future." Michael nodded, understanding the complexity of moving forward after deep loss. "My wife always said that the best way to honor a marriage was to remain open to love rather than closing yourself off because you'd been fortunate enough to experience it once." 6 months later, Michael relocated to Northern California to join the Blackwood Foundation's research team, bringing his expertise in longitudinal outcome studies and community impact measurement. But more importantly, he brought companionship that honored both our past losses and our current possibilities. Our wedding was small and practical, held in Sarah and Preston's mountain house with a few dozen close friends and foundation colleagues. The contrast with Sarah's elaborate reception 15 years earlier was intentional. We wanted to celebrate commitment and partnership rather than social status or family expectations. "Margaret," Sarah said during her toast, "15 years ago you gave Preston and me a house as a wedding gift. Today, we're celebrating the fact that you've finally given yourself permission to build a home." The foundation continued expanding during this period, but with increased focus on sustainability and local ownership. Rather than establishing new programs directly, we began training community organizations to implement our methodologies using their own cultural knowledge and regional resources. "The goal," I explained to a conference of community leaders in Detroit, "isn't to replicate the Blackwood Foundation everywhere. It's to share principles and practices that communities can adapt to serve their own students effectively." This approach proved more successful than direct expansion, creating a network of affiliated organizations that shared resources and research while maintaining independence and local relevance. The Foundation's 20th anniversary celebration was held in the same hotel where we'd established the endowment, but the scope of impact had grown beyond anything I'd imagined when we started with 47 scholarship recipients. "Ladies and gentlemen," Maria Santos announced from the podium, now serving as the Foundation's executive director while I focused on research and policy advocacy, "I'm proud to report that Blackwood Foundation programming has now served over 200,000 students, with affiliated organizations reaching an additional 800,000 young people across 6 countries." The statistics were impressive, but what moved me most were the individual stories shared throughout the celebration. Roberto Hernandez, whose educational technology company now employed over 300 people and provided software to schools in 47 states. Angela Williams, whose research on community-based programming had influenced educational policy in 12 countries. Tommy Rodriguez, who'd established a network of community health clinics that provided medical care and health education in underserved areas. But the story that captured the essence of what we'd built came from Jessica Chen. No relation, despite sharing my surname. A young woman who'd grown up in the Foundation's programs and was now a teacher in the same community where she'd once been a struggling student. 20 years ago, Jessica told the gathered crowd, "I was a high school sophomore who'd been told by several teachers that I wasn't college material. My family had immigrated from Vietnam, my parents worked multiple jobs to support us, and I was struggling academically because I was trying to translate homework assignments for my younger siblings while working part-time to help with household expenses. Jessica paused, looking around the ballroom filled with Foundation alumni, staff members, and supporters. The Blackwood Foundation didn't just give me a scholarship, they gave me a community. Mentors who understood the challenges of being a first-generation college student. Academic support that addressed my actual needs, rather than assuming what I should know. And most importantly, they gave me the message that my background was a strength rather than a limitation. Today, I teach 5th grade in the same school where I once struggled. But now, when I see students facing the same challenges I faced, I know how to connect them with resources and support systems that can change the trajectory of their lives. Jessica's story was repeated dozens of times throughout the evening, as Foundation alumni shared how their own success had become platforms for helping others in their communities. "Margaret," Michael said as we drove home from the celebration, "do you realize what you've created? A foundation that serves students and supports educational equity. More than that, you've created a movement. A generation of educators, advocates, and community leaders who understand that potential exists everywhere, and that their job is to help others discover and develop their capabilities." As I reflected on the 20-year journey from that wedding reception where I'd been ignored to this celebration of systemic educational change, I understood that the most meaningful success wasn't individual achievement. It was creating conditions for others to achieve beyond what they'd believed possible. The foundation had grown beyond my direct management, with alumni now leading programs, conducting research, and developing innovations that surpassed anything I could have created independently. The work had taken on a life of its own, sustained by people who'd experienced its impact and were committed to extending that impact to future generations. 3 years later, I was preparing for retirement from active foundation leadership when I received a call that brought the story full circle in an unexpected way. "Ms. Chen, this is Patricia Whitman Crawford. I think you knew my mother, Elizabeth Whitman." I remembered Mrs. Whitman well. Preston's mother, who'd been part of the Whitman Trust delegation that had proposed our initial partnership. "Patricia, how can I help you?" "Ms. Chen, my mother passed away last month, and in settling her estate, we discovered something that I think will interest you. She kept detailed files about your foundation's work, including newspaper clippings, research reports, and outcome studies spanning 20 years. "That's surprising. I didn't realize Mrs. Whitman followed our work so closely." "Ms. Chen, there's something my family never told you about Mother's interest in your foundation. She spent the last years of her life regretting how our family treated you at Preston and Sarah's wedding." The revelation was unexpected. Mrs. Whitman had always been polite during our professional interactions, but I'd assumed her support for the foundation was pragmatic rather than personal. "What kind of regret?" "Mother said that dismissing you at the wedding was one of the worst mistakes she'd ever made. Not because of your financial resources, which she didn't know about then, but because she'd failed to recognize exceptional character when she encountered it." Patricia explained that Mrs. Whitman had spent years studying the foundation's work and had become a quiet advocate for community-based educational programming, using her social connections to encourage other wealthy families to support similar initiatives. "Ms. Chen, Mother left a letter for you that she wrote several years ago but never had the courage to send. I think she'd want you to have it now." The letter, written in Mrs. Whitman's elegant handwriting, was both an apology and a reflection on the lessons she'd learned from observing the foundation's work. "Dear Margaret, I owe you an apology that's long overdue. At Preston and Sarah's wedding, I treated you with dismissive politeness because I made assumptions about your worth based on superficial observations. I failed to recognize that true character reveals itself through actions rather than appearances, service rather than status. Watching your foundation's work over the past 2 decades has taught me that the most meaningful wealth is the kind that creates opportunities for others. You've built something that honors both your late husband's memory and your own values. And you've done so with a grace and humility that puts my family's traditional approach to philanthropy to shame. I hope someday you'll forgive an old woman who learned too late that wisdom often comes disguised as modesty, and that the most important people in any room are often the ones who draw the least attention to themselves. With admiration and regret, Elizabeth Whitman." Reading Mrs. Whitman's letter in my office overlooking the foundation headquarters that had grown from a single program into a national movement, I felt a sense of completion that had been missing since that awkward wedding reception 23 years earlier. The woman who'd dismissed me as an irrelevant college friend had spent her final years recognizing that character mattered more than credentials, impact more than appearance, service more than status. But more importantly, her letter reminded me that transformation was possible for everyone, not just students who needed educational opportunities, but also wealthy families who needed to learn new ways of measuring success, middle-aged widows who needed to rebuild their lives after loss, and even dismissive in-laws who needed time to understand that worth wasn't always immediately visible. As I prepared to hand over active leadership of the foundation to Maria Santos and the remarkable team of alumni and advocates who would carry the work forward, I thought about the journey from invisibility to influence, from personal grief to systemic change, from individual success to community transformation. They'd ignored me at the wedding because they couldn't see past their assumptions about guidance counselors and college friends and people who chose modest lifestyles despite having other options. But that dismissal had taught me that the most powerful response to being underestimated wasn't demanding recognition. It was building something so meaningful that recognition became irrelevant. The groom had thanked me for a house. We'd built something far more valuable. Proof that potential existed everywhere, that community investment could change lives across generations, and that the most lasting gifts were opportunities rather than objects. David's legacy had provided the financial foundation, but the real wealth had come from using those resources to create conditions where thousands of young people could discover their own capabilities and become advocates for others facing similar challenges. The foundation would continue long after I was gone, sustained by people who understood that their success was connected to others' opportunities, that education was a community responsibility rather than individual privilege, and that the most meaningful wealth was the kind that multiplied when shared. I'd been ignored at a wedding, but the work we'd built together would never be ignored. It would continue creating possibilities, challenging assumptions, and proving that being overlooked was often just the beginning of the most important stories. The house had been a gift, the foundation had become a legacy, and the students whose lives had been changed were now changing the world in ways that honored both where they'd come from and where they were going. That was worth more than any recognition, any apology, any acknowledgement from people who'd initially failed to see what really mattered. True success wasn't about being seen, it was about helping others see their own potential and supporting them as they built futures worthy of their talents and dreams. The groom had thanked me for a honeymoon gift, but what we'd created together was something that would last far longer than any vacation. A legacy of opportunity that would continue blessing families and communities for generations to come. 25 years after that wedding reception, I sat in the garden of the house I now shared with Michael, reading the morning newspaper's coverage of the Blackwood Foundation's Silver Anniversary Gala. The headline read, "From Guidance Counselor to Global Advocate, How One Woman's Vision Transformed Educational Equity." The article was thorough and mostly accurate, though it focused more on individual achievement than on the collaborative effort that had actually built the foundation. But what caught my attention was a sidebar story about unexpected connections between past and present. Former Whitman Trust chairman reflects on partnership that changed philanthropy, the smaller headline read. Below it was a photo of Charles Whitman, now in his 80s, standing in front of a new community center that bore a plaque reading, Elizabeth Whitman Memorial Learning Center. 25 years ago, Charles was quoted as saying, "Our family made one of the worst first impressions in the history of philanthropy. We dismissed someone based on superficial assumptions and nearly missed the opportunity to support the most effective educational work we'd ever encountered." The article went on to describe how the Whitman family had completely restructured their philanthropic approach based on lessons learned from partnering with the Blackwood Foundation, shifting from institutional giving to community-based programming that emphasized local ownership and measurable outcomes. Margaret Chen taught us that true philanthropy isn't about giving money to causes that make donors feel good, Charles continued. It's about supporting work that creates lasting change, even when that work doesn't generate recognition for the funders. Michael joined me on the garden patio, carrying coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd been reading foundation emails before breakfast. "Margaret, Maria forwarded me something I think you'll find interesting." He handed me his tablet, showing an email from Dr. Jessica Chen, the former student who'd become a teacher and was now pursuing her doctorate in education policy. "Dr. Chen," the email began, I wanted to share news about a research opportunity that brings our story full circle. I've been invited to serve as a visiting scholar at Harvard's Graduate School of Education, where I'll be developing a case study about the Blackwood Foundation for their nonprofit management program. Jessica's email continued. But here's the remarkable part. The endowed chair that's funding this research was established by the Whitman family specifically to support studies of community-based philanthropy. They want Harvard MBA students to learn about alternatives to traditional charitable giving. I looked up at Michael, who was smiling with the satisfaction that came from watching long-term plans reach fruition. Michael, do you realize what this means? It means your foundation's methodology is becoming required curriculum at one of the country's most prestigious business schools. Future leaders will learn about community-based philanthropy as a standard approach rather than an alternative model. The implications were staggering. Harvard Business School students who'd once been trained to think about philanthropy in terms of institutional prestige and donor recognition would now learn to evaluate charitable work based on community impact and sustainable outcomes. But there's more, Michael continued, scrolling through additional emails. 5 other business schools have requested permission to develop similar case studies. Your approach to educational equity is becoming a standard model for graduate programs in nonprofit management. As I processed this information, my phone rang with a call from Sarah, whose voice carried the excitement that had become familiar over decades of friendship. Margaret, have you seen this morning's coverage of the anniversary gala? I've seen some of it. What are you referring to specifically? The piece in the Washington Post about federal education policy. Secretary Williams announced that the Department of Education is adopting Blackwood Foundation principles as the framework for all community education grants. Secretary Williams had been Dr. Jennifer Walsh, our former Director of Community Programs who'd moved into federal service and was now leading national education policy development. Sarah, what does that mean in practical terms? It means that every federal dollar spent on community education will be allocated according to criteria you developed: local partnership requirements, long-term outcome measurement, and student-centered programming rather than institutional support. The conversation continued for an hour, with Sarah sharing updates about policy changes, funding shifts, and institutional reforms that were transforming how educational philanthropy operated across the country. After ending the call, I sat quietly in the garden, surrounded by vegetables I'd learned to grow during retirement and flowers that Michael had planted to attract butterflies. The peaceful domesticity felt surreal after decades of constant travel, urgent meetings, and the pressure of managing rapid organizational growth. Margaret, Michael said, settling into the chair beside me, how does it feel to know that your work has influenced national policy at this level? Gratifying, but also strange. When I started the foundation, I was focused on helping individual students access college opportunities. I never imagined it would lead to systemic changes in how we approach educational equity. But isn't systemic change what you were always working toward? Even when you were a guidance counselor, you were trying to change how schools thought about student potential. Michael was right. Looking back, I could see a consistent thread connecting my early work as a teacher, my development of the foundation, and the policy advocacy that had emerged from documenting our programming success. I suppose I was always fighting the same battle, convincing institutions to recognize potential in places where they weren't expecting to find it. And now you've won that battle at a national level. Students across the country will benefit from educational programming that assumes potential exists everywhere rather than just in privileged communities. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. Maria Santos arrived unannounced, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the expression of someone who'd been planning an important conversation. Margaret, I hope you don't mind the surprise visit, but there's something I need to discuss with you in person. Maria had led the foundation brilliantly for the past 5 years, expanding our reach while maintaining the community-based principles that made our programming effective. But her expression suggested this conversation was about more than operational updates. Maria, what's on your mind? Margaret, the Foundation Board has been discussing something that we'd like your input on. We've been approached by UNESCO about developing international programming based on our model. UNESCO's interest represented recognition at a level I'd never anticipated. The United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization wanted to adapt our community-based approach to serve students in developing countries where traditional educational philanthropy had often failed to create lasting change. What kind of programming would they want us to develop? Initially, pilot programs in 6 countries: Mexico, Kenya, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Peru, and Vietnam. The goal would be to demonstrate whether our principles of local partnership and community ownership can be adapted to different cultural and economic contexts. The proposal was ambitious and aligned with our values, but it would also require the foundation to navigate international politics and cultural complexities that we'd never faced in domestic programming. Maria, what's your assessment of our capacity to take on international work? Honestly, I think we're ready. We have staff members who understand community engagement across different cultural contexts. We have research methodologies that can be adapted to measure impact in diverse settings. And we have financial resources sufficient to support careful, gradual expansion. Maria opened her portfolio and withdrew planning documents that showed she'd been thinking about international programming for months. But Margaret, there's something else. UNESCO specifically requested that you serve as senior advisor for the international initiative. They want the Foundation's founder to be personally involved in adapting our methodology to global contexts. The request was flattering but complicated. At 62, I'd been looking forward to focusing on writing, gardening, and the quieter pleasures of marriage with Michael. But the opportunity to extend educational equity programming to students who faced even greater barriers than those we served domestically was compelling. Maria, let me discuss this with Michael and give you an answer next week. That evening, Michael and I took a long walk through our neighborhood, discussing the UNESCO proposal and its implications for our carefully constructed retirement plans. Margaret, what does your instinct tell you about this opportunity? My instinct says it's the natural extension of everything we've built, but I'm also concerned about the complexity of international work and the demands it would place on our time and energy. What if you approached it as a consulting role rather than direct management? You could provide strategic guidance and methodology development without taking responsibility for day-to-day operations. Michael's suggestion offered a way to contribute to international programming without returning to the demanding schedule that had characterized my active leadership of the Foundation. I could spend a few months each year visiting program sites, training local staff, and helping adapt our model to different cultural contexts. Exactly. And the rest of the year, you could focus on writing the book about educational equity that you've been planning for the past 3 years. 2 months later, I was standing in a community center in Nairobi, Kenya, watching local educators implement a pilot version of Blackwood Foundation programming adapted for students whose educational barriers included language differences, economic instability, and limited access to technology. Ms. Chen, said Grace Mwangi, the program coordinator who'd been trained in our methodology during a 2-week residency in California. The response from families has been overwhelming. Parents who'd never considered higher education for their children are now asking about university preparation programs. Grace led me through the center where Kenyan students were receiving academic support, mentorship, and college preparation assistance, using principles we'd developed in American communities, but adapted to address the specific challenges faced by young people in Nairobi. What strikes me most, Grace continued, is how naturally your community partnership model translates to our context. The idea that educational programming should emerge from local needs rather than external assumptions makes perfect sense here. Over the following days, I observed similar adaptations in program sites across Kenya, each one reflecting local cultural values, while maintaining the core principles that made our approach effective. Early identification of potential, comprehensive support systems, and community ownership of educational outcomes. The international work proved to be both challenging and invigorating. Each country required different strategies for building community partnerships, adapting to local educational systems, and measuring outcomes across diverse cultural contexts. But the underlying patterns were remarkably consistent. Students everywhere responded to programming that recognized their potential and provided practical support for achieving their goals. Communities everywhere were willing to invest in educational initiatives when they had authentic ownership of the planning and implementation process. Margaret, said Dr. Patricia Gonzalez, the UNESCO official overseeing our pilot programs, during a review meeting in Paris, your foundation's international work is exceeding all our projections for impact and sustainability. Dr. Gonzalez, the success reflects the strength of local partnerships rather than our methodology. Communities know how to serve their own students. They just need resources and support to implement what they know works. which is exactly why UNESCO wants to expand this programming to 15 additional countries over the next 5 years. The expansion proposal was exciting but would require significant additional resources and staff development. More importantly, it would require the foundation to maintain its community-based approach, while operating across dozens of different cultural and political contexts. Dr. Gonzalez, we'd be interested in expansion, but only if we can maintain our principles of local ownership and authentic community partnership. Ms. Chen, those principles are precisely why we want to expand the programming. Traditional international education aid has often failed because it imposed external solutions, rather than supporting local capacity development. 3 years into the international work, the Blackwood Foundation was operating in 21 countries, serving over 100,000 students annually, and had become a model for culturally responsive educational philanthropy that was being studied and replicated by organizations around the world. But the personal moment that mattered most came during a visit to a program site in rural Vietnam, where I met a young woman whose story reminded me of why the work had always been important. Ms. Chen, said Nguyen Thi Mai, a high school senior who'd been accepted to university with foundation support, I wanted to thank you for creating programs that honor where students come from while helping them achieve where they want to go. Mai explained that she was the first person in her family to attend university, but that foundation programming had helped her navigate the application process without losing connection to her rural community and traditional values. What I love most about your foundation, she continued, is that it doesn't ask students to choose between success and authenticity. I can achieve my educational goals while remaining proud of my background and committed to serving my community. Mai's words captured something essential about what we'd built over nearly 3 decades. A model for educational advancement that honored students' origins while expanding their possibilities, that created opportunities for individual achievement while strengthening community connections. Driving back to the airport through Vietnam's countryside, I thought about the journey from that wedding reception, where I'd been invisible, to this moment of watching students in rural Vietnam access educational opportunities that would transform their lives and communities. The foundation had grown far beyond anything I'd imagined when I first decided to use David's legacy to help students who reminded me of my younger self. But the core mission had remained constant, recognizing potential in places where others might overlook it, providing support that honored both individual dreams and community values, and proving that educational opportunity was a right rather than a privilege. At 71, I was finally ready to step back from active involvement in foundation leadership, confident that the work would continue under the guidance of people who understood both its practical methods and its underlying values. The final board meeting I attended as an active member was held virtually, connecting staff and alumni from around the world, who'd gathered to review the foundation's impact and plan for its continued evolution. 30 years ago, Maria Santos said during her final report as executive director, Margaret Chen started a foundation to help 47 students access college opportunities. Today, the Blackwood Foundation and its affiliated organizations have served over 3 million students across 6 continents. The statistics were impressive, but what moved me more were the individual updates shared by alumni who'd become teachers, doctors, social workers, entrepreneurs, and advocates in their own communities. Roberto Hernandez, now in his 40s, reported that his educational technology company had provided software to schools, serving over 10 million students worldwide. Angela Williams shared news about her research institute, which was training educators in 15 countries to implement community-based programming. Tommy Rodriguez announced the opening of his 50th community health clinic, all located in underserved areas where his work addressed both medical needs and social determinants of health. The foundation's greatest achievement, said Dr. Jessica Chen, now serving as Harvard's Director of Community-Based Philanthropy Studies, isn't the number of students we've served directly. It's the number of educators, advocates, and community leaders we've prepared to serve others throughout their careers. As the meeting concluded and participants signed off from their various locations around the world, I felt a sense of completion that had been building for months. The work would continue without me, sustained by people who'd experienced its impact and were committed to extending that impact to future generations. The foundation had evolved from my individual vision into a collective mission that belonged to everyone who'd been touched by its programming. That evening, Michael and I sat in our garden watching the sunset over mountains that reminded me of the house I'd given Sarah and Preston 30 years earlier. The gift that had once seemed impulsive now felt like the beginning of everything meaningful that had followed. "Margaret," Michael said, "any regrets about stepping back from active foundation work?" I thought about the question while watching hummingbirds visit the flowers we'd planted to attract them. No regrets. The foundation has grown beyond what any individual person could manage, and it's in excellent hands with people who understand both its methods and its mission. And the international work? Any regrets about turning down UNESCO's offer to lead the global expansion? None. The best leaders are the ones who know when to step aside so others can carry the work forward in their own way. What's next? I smiled, thinking about projects that had been waiting for my attention during decades of foundation leadership. Writing, gardening, travel that's about personal discovery rather than professional obligations. And spending time with my husband, who's been remarkably patient with someone who spent 30 years building an educational empire. 6 months later, I was putting the finishing touches on my memoir, tentatively titled, "Invisible: How Being Overlooked Became My Greatest Advantage," when I received a call that brought the story full circle one final time. "Ms. Chen, this is Caroline Whitman Preston. I'm Preston and Sarah's daughter." Caroline was now 25. A recent graduate of the Foundation's Leadership Development Program, who was working as a teacher in an urban school district, where many of her students faced challenges similar to those I'd encountered during my early career as a guidance counselor. "Caroline, how wonderful to hear from you. How are you enjoying your teaching work?" "Miss Chen, I love it, but I'm calling about something else. My parents have been planning a celebration for their 30th wedding anniversary, and they specifically requested that it be held at the mountain house you gave them. The house where it all began, the wedding gift that had revealed my financial capacity and sparked the conversations that led to the Foundation's creation. They want to celebrate with the people who've been most important to their marriage, including you and Mr. Torres. But, Ms. Chen, they also want to make the celebration about more than just their anniversary." What did they have in mind? They want to establish a new scholarship program for first-generation college students, funded by a gift that honors your Foundation's 30th anniversary. They're calling it the Margaret Chen Scholars Program. The proposal was generous and touching, but also unnecessary. The Foundation had already endowed sufficient scholarships to operate in perpetuity, and my name was already associated with more recognition than I'd ever sought. "Caroline, that's incredibly thoughtful, but I'm not sure another scholarship program is needed. Ms. Chen, this wouldn't be about funding. The Foundation already has sufficient resources. This would be about honor. My parents want to create something that formally recognizes your contribution to their lives and to the thousands of students who've benefited from the work you started." "Caroline, can I share something with you about honor and recognition?" "Of course." And in that moment, sitting in the garden where I'd learned to grow things that would outlast any recognition, I understood that the most important lessons were the ones we chose to pass on to the next generation. The story of being ignored at a wedding had become something far more valuable. The beginning of a conversation about worth, service, and the quiet satisfaction that came from building something meaningful without needing acknowledgement. The Foundation would continue, the students would thrive, and the work would evolve in ways I couldn't imagine. But this moment, sharing wisdom with a young woman who represented everything we'd fought to achieve, was the real inheritance. They'd ignored me at the wedding. But what we'd built together would never be ignored, because it lived in the hearts and minds of people who understood that true success meant creating opportunities for others to discover their own potential. The end.